this conversation because I've just lost my camera. I'm not sure this conversation has ever happened in a kind of structured way. I know we all talk about it all the time. It did come up in Copenhagen at the last members' assembly. There's a couple of aspects to this. I'm back. There's a couple of aspects to this. There's the strategic, what should we focus on? And then there's the how do we do that? And I know Stephen Flower or ODS are doing another session right now on that second bit. But I think it'd be useful for us as a community to have this conversation. I think it could be useful for IATI, especially when reflecting on their strategy and so on, about where to prioritize further research and effort. So in terms of today, what we are going to do is we are going to quickly go through a little bit of the current data set just to familiar ourselves with what we're talking about here, what IATI has managed to achieve to date, which is kind of extraordinary. We're then going to talk about different ways about thinking about coverage, and I'm using coverage as a phrase to talk about where we have data versus where we don't have data. And I know we can all, us IATI folk, get into the lexicon that's appropriate or not. Coverage is probably not the right word. We'll fix it later, but right now we're going to call it coverage. We're then going to talk about the role of the index and what it does and doesn't do. Just very briefly, just because that is one of the mechanisms that exists to incentivize and encourage publishers to fill gaps in the data. Then it's time for the discussion, which I'm hoping will be kind of 60% of or 70% of this. And then we're going to do a poll to kind of capture some views as well. So in terms of the current data set, just to focus on a couple of things, and this data was pulled a little while ago, so it may not be completely up to date right now. It's based on some previous work that we did. But one of the things that you've got to acknowledge is that on the one hand, we have a huge wealth of data in the IATI data set, 9.6 gigabytes, hundreds of thousands of activities and files. On the other hand, it's split across a large number of organizations. The median number of activities per publisher is 4, whereas the mean number is 659. So it shows you the diversity of the types of organizations that we have putting data into the IATI data set. Ways of thinking about coverage. So you could think about this in terms of geographic coverage of providers. Are we seeing, where are the providers of official development assistance or other development finance based? And are we seeing enough, for example, southern or non-traditional donors in the data? We could think about coverage in terms of geographic coverage of the recipients. Are certain countries or regions missing from the data? You could think about coverage in terms of thematic focus. So do we have the data we want to have around, say, health or education or WASH? Are we capturing most of that with the current publishing that's going on? You could think about coverage in terms of organization type. So do we have the majority of the aid agencies covered? Do we have the majority of UN agencies or private sector contractors covered? You could think about coverage in terms of traceability. And if you were just in the session with Taya and her colleagues, they talked a lot about traceability. So, there's a question there of, do we just focus on the existing publishers, but actually get them to focus on or prioritize traceability and getting the various actors in their delivery chains to publish? Or do we focus, for example, on richness of the data? And an example I'll be talking about in a moment is, do we ask for more impact data, more results and evaluations, and so on, as an example? And during the discussion, it'd be good to hear any of your thoughts on other ways to think about the data set in terms of the data that we have and the data that we don't have, and ways of thinking about coverage. So just to show a few visuals, I'm going to caveat the data now to say this is not perfect. We were pretty rushed. That's our own fault in pulling this together. But a fundamental message of this work is that you would want to do more work on these issues to try and understand what our baseline is of coverage before we dig any further. But in terms of geographic coverage, this is where the publishers are based. As I say, if you wanted to figure out whether this was right or wrong, or we were capturing the right number of organizations, you'd have to do further analysis. But it's useful to spark a conversation and to think about, is this something we want to focus on, that you have a fair representation of where providers of development assistance are based? And then equally moving on, geographic coverage of recipient countries. So do we capture a fair proportion of the funding that's going to individual countries or not. And again, you'd need to do some analysis. You'd probably want to use maybe the OECD DAC data as a proxy here. But it's a fundamental question: is the IATI data set covering the genuine development needs of countries globally, or have we got some major gaps? Are there some major regions or countries that we're missing a substantial part of data from? And should our strategy therefore be to try and fill those gaps by working with the organizations that are working there to make sure that they publish the data? In terms of thinking about coverage by theme, there's a lot more themes than this. We cut this table short. I think this table looks quite interesting because on the one hand, you've got a lot of sectors that I think are very high because development finance institutions and multilateral development banks put a lot of money into these sectors. But the fundamental question is, per theme, are we pretty close to accurate in terms of the data that we're capturing from publishers, and are we seeing a fair amount of data for each theme? I'd argue maybe not. Just looking towards the bottom of the table, refugees in donor countries, that number looks pretty low for me, given where we are globally. So, with some further analysis, you could draw out, actually, we're missing some specific sectors. And surely if there's, I don't know, going to be another pandemic, or we've got a climate crisis going on, maybe we ought to, as a community, prioritize that we focus on those themes. So sorry for rushing through this, but hopefully this is giving you a sense of the different ways that we think about this, and hopefully it will fuel a discussion in a moment. In terms of coverage by organization type, we have a huge number of international and national NGOs, understandably, but do we have the right number of, say, should we prioritize that UN agencies, for example, are publishers, and should we have a target of getting all UN agencies to publish? Should we focus more on the private sector contractors who spend a large proportion of aid? Or should we continue to focus on the big spenders, the big development agencies, such as those that we're missing, such as those in the Far East, for example, where we get very little, if any, data? So that's another way of thinking about this coverage question and where we should focus. Then I'll move on to traceability. So this is a picture of what we used to call the traceability jellyfish. If you're in Taya's session a minute ago, you would have heard that, sorry, one second. Can you close the door? If you were in Taya's session a minute ago, you would have seen an equivalent diagram of the Dutch MFA and its implementers and how they connect all of their data and so on. In terms of traceability, these figures are drawn from some data that we pulled a couple of years ago, so in 2019, highlighting kind of what we all know, that the majority of upstream and downstream links sit with a few publishers, and at that time it was DFID, the Dutch MFA, the Belgian MFA, and that actually most other donors aren't working on traceability in the same way, aren't prioritizing, and so on. So another way that we can think about coverage of data is, are we seeing the delivery chains? Are we connecting them up, and so on, for the existing publishers who are publishing? Taya, I asked if you might be able to say a couple of things on traceability before we get into the discussion around, it's not necessarily a cheap or easy or quick thing to do. It's taken you guys effort. You've learned a lot from that. So could you say a couple of things about what it's taken you to get where you are, and what the benefits have been?
Yeah, well, thanks, Gary. All of this is good to talk about traceability, but also the other aspects, of course. I think there's a couple of challenges in traceability. First of all, the standard allows for a couple of ways to record the links to other organizations and other activities, and I feel like maybe there are too many ways, and everyone does their own thing, and sometimes there's a difference of insight in how to use the standard correctly to get good traceable data. I also think for us, it's not been helpful that the tools that we use for data quality don't always support showing that traceability is missing here. The Secretariat's tools, other tools, it very often doesn't focus on that because it's not been our focus as a community. So that reflects it, I think. Of course, and also we spent a lot of work on training our partners, but we did eventually get there, and I think it also helps that we have a lot of learning from that now. So any government who plans to have their partners publish anytime soon, we have a textbook here. You can call us any day. But I do think there's a couple of things that we couldn't have done without traceability. First of all, there's our government's focus on result-driven approach. We need to show that we achieve results. We can't just do that if we only have the data of the organization we just happen to sign the contract with. We need to have deeper information because again, it's 3-4 organizations deep sometimes. And the other thing I think is there's a lot of cynicism about aid. We have our country's biggest party currently suggesting that we cut development aid altogether. Sure, that won't happen, but still, it's the mood of the country. I think if we battle the idea that it all goes to the salaries of NGO directors, anything we can battle that with is very helpful. And I think this is a very good tool to make sure that we can show everyone this is where it goes and this is the results that we achieve. So that's my take on this.
Sorry,
was I too
lost,
brief? I can go
no,
on.
no, no, that was perfect, Taya. I lost my controls somehow. Fabio, it's great that we've got some young members here for this session. Oh, thank you very much. Yes, and in terms of traceability, the Aid Transparency Index has introduced the network data indicator, which is trying to push on this. So I'm going to just go through the last couple of slides, then we can start the discussion. The final way of thinking about coverage is around the richness of the data. So should we focus on making sure that the data for every activity is more valuable and more useful? And what these charts show here, these were taken from our Aid Transparency Index work, looking at objectives, results, reviews, and evaluations, and the proportion of activities that have standardized data for these, i.e. IATI data, versus those that don't. And if we're in a situation where less than 35% of all activities have reviews and evaluations with them, then maybe, again, from different ways of thinking about coverage, the community might decide, you know what, we ought to address that. For the activities we're publishing, we ought to have reviews, evaluations, results, and objectives as a priority before we go and try and focus on other publishers and so on. So different ways to think about it. Finally, just to talk about the role of the index. So I think most of you are familiar that the Aid Transparency Index assesses 50 leading aid organizations, multilateral development banks, government agencies, philanthropies, etc. It does that every 2 years. We also have a development finance institution transparency index, which looks at 27 multilateral and bilateral development banks. And you can see from the chart there the way that the index has driven quality, timeliness, etc., and quantity of published data. The organizations featured in the index, in the Aid Transparency Index, represent 84% of all the data that's on the IATI registry. So, that kind of exists, and you can see that. I mean, there's been independent academic research that shows the power of the Aid Transparency Index in incentivizing and encouraging data and so on. So we may want to think beyond those organizations. Obviously, if anything ever happens to the Aid Transparency Index, we'd need to come up with a plan to keep holding the feet to the fire for these agencies to make sure they keep working on their data. In fact, we just started the 2024 Aid Transparency Index on Monday, and you wouldn't believe how many people fixed all of their data problems on Thursday and Friday last week in preparation for it. So we're already looking after a big bunch of the existing publishers, so we can have a discussion about what else. So let's go on to the discussion. And these are some questions that I put to kind of guide us. But equally, you may have your own thoughts, your own contributions on this. How do you think about data coverage? Where do you think we should focus our efforts? How might we practically do that? So let me open it up for discussion. And then towards the end of the session, we've got a quick poll that allows you to kind of, will allow us to enumerate how strongly people are feeling about different things. So have we got any, I'll look in the chat, but have we got any comments? Peter, John, Amara, you were very patient waiting for me to finish. So yes, please jump in while I have a look at the comments. Do I need to unmute you, or can you unmute yourself? Okay. So I think we can't hear you, Peter, if you're speaking. You look like you're unmuted. I can see comments from Michelle. Okay. So Peter's question, and then we'll go to Michelle. What are the effective strategies to handle missing values in data? So I guess there's a couple of ways of thinking about that. I don't know if any of the publishers here want to talk about any systems or processes they have for making sure that their data is complete when they're publishing for an activity. Michelle, yeah.
Yeah, I can just say, as we talked about this, I mean, it's not an exact science. I mean, we run reports pre-publishing, we're running reports looking for missing values. A lot of it is feedback, as I was mentioning in the traceability workshop just before this. You know, it's talking to Taya and having her give me the list, and us sharing our list with her, and getting the calls from, you know, I had a donor just this morning from the Korean government say, hey, because we put in our contract like org IDs if we can get them. So the donor giving us this. So it's not nearly as systematized as we would hope. And it's a lot of just heavy lifting and slogging through it, and iterations and iterations of doing it. So there's the big thing is just when we go to publish looking for the missing data, we run everything through the validator in advance, but sometimes it's just not able to get to the data, and we have to live with the fact that it's not going to be there. I don't know if that helps, but it's essentially just a manual process and human process, not a system process.
Yeah. No, I think that's useful, Michelle. Thanks for sharing that. Nicholas, you've put something about identifiers in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, or if anyone's got any views. You're talking about the fact that you struggle to find identifiers for implementers, and you're now working to create a registry of WASH organizations. Does anybody want to speak to that? And I know that on the identifier front, I know there's been a fair amount of progress, and people have been trying to build lists and come up with solutions for this. But does anyone who's more technically able than me want to say anything to that? Yeah, Michelle.
I'll say this again, the same thing. We spend a lot of time looking for identifiers, and it just happens to be that I was familiar with this in my prior life before coming to the UN about how to find these things and searching. The org ID finder is a huge tool that I use constantly, because if they're not a publisher and they're not in the DAC agency or the DAC recipient list, we go to the org ID finder and we start saying, okay, well, let me go to the US registry for companies, or Companies House in the UK, or the Chamber of Commerce in the Netherlands. And but it is time consuming. So again, one of the tools we've asked the technical team for is there a way to scrape? Because there's no point, if I've already found like I asked Taya, what's the number for Plan International in Guinea? Because I could spend hours trying to figure it out, but if somebody else already knows it, let's share that information. So we're hopeful that it might not be WASH specific, but hopefully there's going to be a tool that can be created that scrapes already published org IDs and allows a new publisher or someone who doesn't have that data in their data set yet to say, who's out there that maybe has already worked with these guys and they have an org ID. And maybe it's not maybe it's not the right registration, but if we're consistently using the same org ID for them, we're way better than we were with just not even bothering with the number. So that's one thing we're hoping will be a tool available so that people can find org IDs better, for anyone who's already in the world of not just a publisher, but somewhere in the participating org ID, whether they're a funder, whatever role they play. And that would include implementing partners.
Yeah. And looking at the chat, you might have a volunteer in the form of Nicholas, who's just said they'd love to help set up a tool like that. Taya?
Yeah, I would think that results are very important as well. And I think it's also hard to analyze because the results are all over the place, of course. So I think we should also put energy in a good international result framework that's usable for a lot of organizations. But I think results data, the stat that I saw, is not as bad as I feared. There are a lot of organizations who publish results. I'm sure a lot of them are our beloved partners in the Netherlands, but also others, and I think that's great. I think we should do more of that and also help organizations go beyond the phase where every organization who publishes or thinks about results first ends up, which is publishing and tracking too many results. I think keeping it simple is key, and no one ever achieves that the first round, but they do in the end, and I think that makes the data much more usable. So I would encourage a focus of the community also on results.
Yeah. And what do we think about, because we were talking a fair amount there about traceability. You've just changed it to results. I mean, there are other areas. You could say, okay, actually, geolocation is the thing we all really want because we want to be able to identify the specific location and so on. So within that richness discussion, you could pick various aspects of the data. But of course, one of the things I always think we're guilty of is, as a community, is because most of us are publishers, and it's just a full-time job doing this on a daily basis and making sure the data's right and dealing with your own implementers, that actually stepping back and looking at the wider data set, we don't do it that often. My team often are doing that because they're doing research on, for example, where does money for women's economic empowerment go, or where does what are we working on at the moment, climate finance go, and then we see the gaps. And as an example, China is a huge gap, and what's happened then. Other organizations have come up with scraping tools and checking media and so on to build their own data set, which doesn't link to IATI, doesn't align, and so on. And we've kind of got this orphan data set over there of what China is doing on the Belt and Road Initiative and beyond. So it would be good to hear from anyone if anyone's thinking, actually there are some specific publishers that maybe we should focus on, or there are some specific sources of development finance that we should focus on. And while you're thinking about that, Herman, over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about the coverage, the discussion about to which location does our money go, and where are the results being achieved. And I think for all these coverage questions you mentioned in the perspectives you mentioned in the sheets in your introduction, I think the traceability is key, because in our case, as the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 80% of our budget goes to intermediate organizations like the UN or like big international NGOs. We do not know beforehand exactly where our money will be spent, and so we don't have much location information. But if you have the traceability, then the organizations we work with, they usually provide funds to the organizations which usually know to which country the money is going, and in which local exact locations the money will be spent, and where the results will be achieved. And so I think the question about coverage and measuring coverage is tightly connected to the question of having the full chain transparency, being able to follow the money and the results.
And look, and it's, I mean, in a moment, if Annelies is on the call, or maybe someone from the Secretariat, it might be good to hear from them in terms of how they reflect on this, because obviously this is, part of the day job is to think about which organizations can we go after, encourage to become publishers, encourage to become members, and build the community and build the data and so on. But to your point, Herman, look, I think it's completely a legitimate strategy for us as a community to say no more publishers at the top level. We're just going to focus on the ones that exist and make sure that we get the money and the traceability chain all the way down. That's and say that it's okay that China won't ever. We're not going to put any energy into making sure that China or the other UN agencies, the other 20 that don't publish or whatever publish. We're going to focus on filling out the delivery chain and making sure we've got that connected data and so on. That is absolutely a legitimate strategy, as long as we're all conscious of what it means we're not focusing on. And I don't know what's right or wrong here, so I'm quite fortunate. But Annalise, I don't know, did you want to, you've been living and breathing this question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And unfortunately, the parallel session, which is being led by Stephen, is looking at exactly this, the question around scaling the publishers and which ones we should be focusing and not. So my short answer is no, we haven't come across an answer yet, but it's certainly something that we're digging into and curious. I know that Stephen has given some analysis during that session on who is publishing and how many publishers, but actually who is publishing the most and the best quality. So maybe that's just one to go back and look at the recording of afterwards. But Gary, it's absolutely in our sights how to scale, whether to scale, in which direction, and so forth.
Yeah. And I did, for those who are wondering why there are two similar sessions, I did reach out to Stephen and say that maybe we should do this together. I got the impression his was more technical in terms of what would the tooling look like, but hopefully, and this is probably a conversation that needs to go on into Columbia, into future strategy discussions and so on. Michelle, to your question about coverage, I mean, in terms of the number of UN agencies that are publishing, I think the number we had was 25. I believe there are 47, something like that, UN agencies. And I know that they're not all equal, and there's a very confusing chart somewhere that explains them all. Oh, someone said 69. Okay, that's a lot. So, again, you could do that. There's another way you could cut all of this. You could say, forget coverage and geographic and so on, or org type. If your budget is over X, you should be a publisher, and we should focus on that, and we should set that as an expectation. I think it's brilliant that the IATI community set out to just build a movement, get as much data as possible, try and bring in as many interested people. And that's why we've got this really passionate community that care about it. But now that we've built so much momentum, there's a question about, okay, well, with the resources we have, where do we focus? And it might be a better way to say, do we set out on a campaign that says if your budget is over $1 billion and you're not publishing to IATI, there's a fundamental problem there. And we're a transparency campaign, so I can imagine us being involved in that. But that would again be a legitimate use of our time, right? To agree this is where the gaps are, and this is what we should do, and this is how we should measure it and incentivize it, and so on.
Yeah, if I can just say off of that it's true. It's not sheer numbers. The fact that there's 25 out of 69, as long as the 25 of us that do publish represent the large portion of expenditures, then we've got good coverage, because there might be some parts of the UN that are just so small, or they don't work in this space that it's not relevant. But absolutely, and maybe Gary and you and I can have a conversation offline, since I'm within the UN, I'm within the Publishers Working Group, and I'm within the UN Transparency Group. We can maybe talk about what we want to go after, if there's a need there. Thanks. Over.
Thank you, Michelle. And what I can't speak to specifically with the UN is the quality and the completeness of their data and the timeliness of their data. We already feature a few UN agencies in the Transparency Index, and they do perform well. UN OCHA, for example, in the 2024 index, we're including UNHCR and World Food Programme for obvious reasons, refugees and food security. And we'll see how they perform. But, as well as the number, we want to see the performance as well. Paul, over to you.
Yes, I'm very new to the organization, and even these meetups, this is only the second meeting I've attended, so I'm not familiar with all the nonprofits that are involved with and the IATI data that you get IATI data from. But addressing number 3, and my background, by the way, is as a product owner and Scrum Master. So I've worked with investment banks and so on, where I would bridge from the business to developers to say, this is what we're going to work on next, and this is what functionality, business value we're going to deliver. So my comment related to number 3, practically encourage and support improvements in coverage. Whatever the business decision is, as far as expanding to new groups, new providers of data, and I forget the term you were all using, but it made me wonder, based on a previous project from a client years ago, that is there a way of characterizing types of data providers to be able to say then or maybe it's even for all providers to say, this is the minimum set of fields that we have to have so that we can import data from a broad set of providers first, or be able to set up something in a database that would say this is now we can at least set a template for all of them, and then over time, and then prioritize which ones we want to import data from first. And they would have, but we would have 7 or 10 or 12 fields or whatever number it is, and say that applies to every group, and that maybe there are also other areas of data that there would be a subset that's universal to that type of data, that field of data, that group of data, and then the implementation that's fleshed out for each relevant sub silo within that group. Each of those groups of data comes later, and you prioritize based on business need, however that is, whether it's country, or amount of donations, etc.
Yeah. No, that's a great thought, Paul, and it's certainly probably something that we as a community should revisit. I'm going to lean on the experts that we have with us here to maybe answer that, because I know there have been pushes in the past to talk about essential data fields, and there have been efforts to try and prioritize and think about these things and so on. Does anyone want to talk about how that's gone, whether that's worked, how we might adjust that in the future? I'm looking specifically at Herman now. He doesn't know that, but that's where I'm looking.
Oh dear. Yeah, this is a very interesting discussion. The problem we run into in that not all publishers are the same. You have different types of publishers, and for different types of publishers, there are a different set of data elements you might expect them to publish. So I do not think that you can have a common set for everybody, and then still have very valuable data. On the other hand, I do think that the current standard and all its with all its different ways of doing things can be streamlined somewhat, because we did a few years ago, we did a small investigation in how many data elements were used by were published by how many publishers, and there is a very long tail of IATI data elements which are only published by a very small number of publishers, which makes the IATI standard quite complex for a very limited group. And I think there some improvements can be made. I would rather turn it around and say, if we invest in stimulating that certain data is published, then we should do it from a use-based case. What's the use case, and what does that use case need, and pick the most important use cases we can think of and start with them, because then you will have added value, and you will put your efforts based on demand instead of supply.
Yeah,
that were my 2 cents.
Thank you, Herman.
It's a difficult decision to come to a core, to define the core, because everybody thinks something different about that, depending on their use case. That's the summary.
Yeah, 100%. And within my organization, we can have 2 different use cases on the same day, focusing one on global top level donors and one focusing on who gets the money at the end of the chain. So yeah, it's there are those different use cases. Just keeping up with the conversation. So Nicholas was saying, perhaps not the original goal of IATI. It seems to me that small funders, some of which collectively are huge, is there a version of IATI, which is kind of Paul's point, but then you talk about a tool that can be used to target those. And I guess it's I guess the thing is strategically, we agree on where we think we should focus our effort and where we should fill the gaps, and then we determine whether what the right approach is. And if we determine that actually it's a large number of small publishers that we want in order to either fix the traceability problem or try and get as many players in the system or as much financial coverage as possible, then yes, we should be talking about tools. And I think that's what the ODS session is doing right now, is talking about, well, how do we give those people the tools, and to Paul's point, how do we have a limited set of data so they don't feel they have to publish on the whole standard. And then what else have we got? And yeah, again, more support maybe for thinking about how, and I know those conversations can be challenging, because I know I've been in some of those conversations where you start looking at fields and saying, but that is kind of useful, and it's really hard to delete the ones from the essential list that are already there. But no, for sure. So let's just see. Has anyone else got any thoughts on different ways of thinking about coverage? If this was your thing, where would you focus your energy? Annalise?
Not just beyond coverage, but inside the Secretariat. As you know, we've been working through this sort of transition period during which ODS has been looking at a number of the tools and processes and giving support for the first time to so many different kinds of publishers. And we're certainly thinking about this. You know, if there needs to be a sort of a lighter set of fields that our smaller publishers might just be able to publish, perhaps using our new IATI publisher tool. Alternatively, the other thing that we're looking at, or in addition, the other thing that we're looking at is the proposed new data use data access tool side of things, so that, you know, if in combination with a lighter set of fields to be published, or a lighter way for smaller CSOs and organizations, there should also be a way of pulling that relevant data for those who just want a light set of data. So yes, all in our sites. We've just been spending this last couple of months to settle things in for ODS to really get their heads into the tech suite that they have available to them, and only then we'll start to propose new changes along with the governing board and bring those forward to members. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Annalise. That's really useful. Elma, over to you, and then we'll do the poll and wrap up.
Hiya. You might want to mute yourself. We're in the same room, so I was just going to pick up on Herman's point around the challenges of defining what the core of the standard should be, and perhaps if we're thinking about the different types of publishers and the different types of information that they should be providing, considering what information they generally have access to, we could think as a community about developing different types of core sets of elements for different types of publishers. So if it's an NGO in country, in a partner country, then the focus should be more on results and on locations versus things like budgets, which, you know, we would already perhaps have from top of the aid chain organizations. So perhaps the challenge doesn't need to be about defining a single core set of elements, but a variety of those. Thanks.
Thanks, Alma. So if Sander, if you're there, if you can launch the poll for us, and this is just to give us a way of capturing how strongly people feel about various things, gives us a bit of a litmus test. I think there's 7 questions here, and you're essentially saying how important or not do you think each one is. And at the bottom, there's a box for other. So if you think I've missed something fundamental, and please, I will not be offended, add in there where you think we should focus our energies to fill gaps in the current data set.
I'm not sure, with my lack of knowledge and experience with the organizations, I'm not sure that my input would be valid, and it might skew it.
Feel free to. I thought the same thing, Paul. So I'm closing my my poll. But if you feel like you have a view on this, please go ahead.
I'll skip some of the questions then. Okay, thank you, Gary.
And maybe Sander, you can give me some kind of signal when we're good to wrap up.
Yeah, sure. I'm just checking if people still need some time to respond. I see that people are still filling out the survey, so just maybe a few more seconds, and it's yeah, the closing starts in about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that we stop now almost. Yeah, I still see some coming in. Let's give people a few more seconds if that's okay, Gary.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. I think we've got a couple of minutes until 5 o'clock here. And then do we get to see the results of the poll, Sander?
Yes, correct. I'll end the poll and then I'll share the results.
You want transparency in the poll data, Gary? Huh.
I was planning to sell it, Michelle. With 2 elections, one in the US and one in the UK next year, a bit of poll transparency would be much appreciated.
I'm very happy to be living in Switzerland right now.
All right, I think 72% participated, so that's quite a good score.
Right.
So shall I end the poll? And then you can have, yeah, there's a few more minutes to reflect on the results, of course, and I'll share the results with everybody.
Right.
I think you have to answer all questions to be able to participate. I answered 5 and 6, and it didn't let me save or
Yeah,
submit.
you did have to put everything in.
Okay. Well, so we've got now I can't remember what the questions were in what order. Number 5 is clearly the winner. And was 5 coverage? I think it was. Sorry, traceability. I'm not sure. Where's my thing? 1,
3, 4.
Yes, traceability.
Traceability is 5. Well, linking data, yes, 54%, and that was traceability was 5.
Yeah. So, and then richness was 6. Okay. So, and then, okay. Well, we'll have to look at the data because maybe we'll have to see. But the one thing we always have to be cautious of with traceability is the selection bias of this group. This group is mostly IATI passionate people who are publishers on a day-to-day basis and have a lot of work to do to achieve that. I guess if we move forward strategically as IATI, as the community, to think about where we want to focus energies, what the strategic goals are going to be, we'll have to include a wider range of people. And to Herman's point, we'll have to include a bunch of users to help balance this out, because we might think that traceability is absolutely the be all and end all. And I think Taya gave some good examples earlier of how traceability has helped the Dutch MFA with a bunch of challenges they've had. But at the same time, users might be sitting there saying, no, guys, we're missing fundamental data on climate finance. We're missing fundamental information about the Far East and development funds that are coming out of there. We don't have UN visibility like we should have, given the grand bargain and so on. So look, I don't have any of the answers. It's been a privilege to speak with you all and chair this session. So thank you very much for your energy and engagement. And I will now conclude so that we can wrap up the day. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.
That was great.